Have you ever wondered what secrets lie hidden in history, buried so deeply that entire civilizations tried to erase them? What if the religions we know today, the ones taught in schools and preached in churches, deliberately concealed the existence of ancient gods who once shaped human life with wisdom, power, and profound spiritual knowledge? Imagine a time when the black gods were not just stories, but living symbols of creation, justice, fertility, and divine connection, deities whose presence guided rulers, warriors, and ordinary people alike. Their influence was so powerful that it resonated through every ritual, festival, and daily practice, creating a spiritual system that intertwined life, nature, and the cosmos. For thousands of years, this sacred knowledge was hidden, forbidden, or deliberately suppressed. The faith of the black gods survived slavery, invasions, and relentless attempts by colonizers and religious institutions to erase it from memory. But why was such wisdom concealed? The answer lies in fear and control. Those who understood the energy and authority of the black gods were seen as a threat to colonial powers and religious hierarchies, so their teachings were silenced, their rituals banned, and their sacred symbols demonized. Yet, even in the shadows, these truths endured. Through whispers, songs, the rhythmic beats of drums, and secret festivals, the essence of the black gods survived, waiting for the day when it could be revealed once more. In this journey, we will uncover what history tried to hide, explore the living faith of these ancient deities, and reconnect with the spiritual power that once guided entire civilizations. By the end of this video, you won't just see history differently. You'll feel it, realizing that the black gods were real, their wisdom profound, and their legacy alive, patiently waiting for those courageous enough to seek it. When we look back at the cradle of human civilization, Africa stands as a beacon of immense wisdom, culture, and spiritual depth. Ancient African civilizations like Egypt, Nubia, and Kush were not only advanced in architecture, governance, and trade, but were deeply rooted in profound spiritual traditions that shaped every aspect of daily life. These civilizations understood that life was more than mere survival. It was a delicate balance between humanity, nature, and the divine. Every ruler, every warrior, and even common citizens were guided by this intricate spiritual knowledge, which dictated morality, justice, and societal order. At the heart of these civilizations lay a deep reverence for the black gods, deities whose influence permeated both the heavens and the earth. These gods were far more than symbolic figures. They represented forces of creation, life, death, fertility, and justice. Temples, pyramids, and sacred spaces were meticulously designed, not only as architectural marvels, but as conduits for spiritual energy, aligning humans with cosmic forces. Rituals, chants, and ceremonies were performed with precision, often tied to the cycles of the sun, moon, and stars. Such practices ensured that people remained connected to ancestral wisdom and the divine rhythm of the universe. However, over centuries, much of this sacred knowledge was systematically hidden, forgotten, or erased. Some deities faded from memory as foreign invasions disrupted the social and spiritual fabric of these civilizations. Colonizers, conquerors, and later religious institutions actively sought to rewrite history, suppressing African spiritual practices and replacing them with foreign belief systems. They labeled indigenous rituals as pagan or witchcraft, and destroyed sacred texts, artifacts, and temples. Despite these efforts, fragments of this knowledge endured, quietly preserved in oral traditions, music, dance, and community rituals. The hidden spiritual history of Africa reveals a legacy that goes beyond mere cultural pride. It shows a civilization that mastered the balance between the tangible and the intangible, between the material world and the spiritual realm. The wisdom of Egypt, Nubia, and Kush guided rulers in governance, inspired warriors in battle, and fostered societal cohesion through shared spiritual understanding. Even in times of oppression, enslaved Africans carried these practices across continents, camouflaging them in dances, chants, and festivals to preserve their sacred heritage. What is remarkable is how resilient this spiritual knowledge was. Despite slavery, invasions, and centuries of religious censorship, the essence of African spirituality survived. Drumming rituals, chants, symbolic gestures, and sacred storytelling were more than cultural expressions. They were living vessels of spiritual energy. They kept ancestral memory alive, passing lessons, warnings, and guidance to future generations. Modern scholars and archaeologists have begun to uncover traces of these practices, from ceremonial masks and drums to texts with intricate symbolic meaning. Each discovery underscores a civilization that viewed life as interconnected, sacred, and governed by unseen forces that demanded respect, understanding, and harmony. By exploring this historical context, we begin to understand that the Black gods and African spiritual traditions were not peripheral or primitive. They were central to civilization itself. They provided a moral compass, a framework for understanding the universe, and a system for connecting humanity with the divine. Rediscovering this hidden history is not just about honoring the past. It is about reconnecting with profound spiritual knowledge that has the power to inspire, guide, and transform, even today. As we move forward in this journey, it becomes clear that understanding the spiritual foundations of ancient African civilizations is key to uncovering the truths that history tried to conceal. Suppression and erasure. Throughout history, the spiritual knowledge and sacred practices of African civilizations faced relentless suppression and erasure. European colonizers and religious institutions deliberately sought to dismantle the rich tapestry of African spirituality, viewing it as a threat to their political control and religious authority. Sacred rituals, chants, symbols, and traditions that had guided societies for centuries were systematically labeled as witchcraft, pagan, or even evil. Temples were destroyed, sacred texts were burned, and communities were coerced into abandoning their indigenous beliefs. What was once a thriving spiritual system that shaped moral conduct, governance, and daily life was deliberately concealed, rewritten, or erased from public memory. This suppression was not merely incidental. It was a calculated effort to control populations and replace African spiritual frameworks with foreign religious and cultural systems. By imposing new beliefs, colonizers aimed to sever people from their ancestral knowledge and weaken the spiritual autonomy that had empowered African communities. The consequences were profound. Entire generations lost touch with the rituals, symbols, and philosophies that had once defined their civilizations. Yet, despite centuries of oppression, fragments of this wisdom endured, often hidden within music, dance, storytelling, and clandestine ceremonies. Both academia and religious institutions played a significant role in perpetuating this erasure. Scholars and clergy often chose convenience over truth, ignoring or discrediting findings that revealed the depth and complexity of African spirituality. Archaeological excavations, however, tell a different story. Masks, ceremonial objects, and ancient temples reveal practices deeply connected to nature, the elements, and spiritual forces, rituals that resonate with current African traditions. These discoveries demonstrate that African religion was far more than cultural expression. It was a comprehensive spiritual system linking individuals directly to life's energy and ancestral guidance. Despite this evidence, mainstream narratives often marginalize or distort the significance of African spiritual practices. Rituals were simplified, misinterpreted, or dismissed as superstition. The knowledge that had once guided rulers, healers, and communities was trivialized, stripped of its sacred context, and misrepresented as folklore. This deliberate silence extended into textbooks, religious teachings, and historical accounts, shaping generations of people to accept a skewed version of their own heritage. The true purpose of African spiritual traditions was healing, empowerment, and connection, not the negative connotations imposed by outsiders. Ancestors, natural forces, and cosmic energy were central to a philosophy that saw the universe as an interconnected web, where actions carried consequences and intentions mattered deeply. Rituals, drumming, chants, and ceremonial movements were not mere performance. They were energetic alignments, designed to harmonize body, mind, and spirit. The suppression of these practices was an attack not only on spirituality, but also on knowledge, autonomy, and cultural identity. Yet, the resilience of African spirituality is remarkable. Despite centuries of forced conversion, persecution, and censorship, these practices survived in disguised forms, through festivals, music, dance, and oral traditions. Even today, the echoes of these rituals can be found across continents, hidden in ways that preserve their power and meaning. Understanding this history is crucial. It reveals that African spirituality was never just a cultural artifact. It was a living, dynamic system of knowledge and power, deliberately suppressed to serve political and religious agendas. By uncovering these truths, we begin to restore the legacy that was nearly erased, reclaiming a heritage that connects us to our ancestors. The rich spiritual knowledge of ancient African civilizations is not lost to time. It is preserved in archaeological artifacts, ceremonial objects, masks, drums, and ancient texts, all of which reveal a civilization deeply connected to the divine and to the rhythms of life. Every object was more than decorative. It was a conduit of spiritual energy, carrying ancestral wisdom and guiding communities in their daily lives. Temples, pyramids, and sacred spaces were carefully constructed to reflect cosmic principles, aligning humanity with the cycles of nature and the cosmos. From intricate carvings on masks to the resonating power of ceremonial drums, each artifact tells a story of a people who viewed the universe as an interconnected web of life, energy, and divine order. African traditions did not exist in isolation. They influenced the broader spiritual narrative, including biblical stories and apocryphal texts. Rituals, metaphors, and symbolic objects like the Ark of the Covenant show striking parallels to ancient African practices, suggesting that some of the foundational elements of Western religious texts were shaped by African spiritual knowledge. Even the Book of Enoch, often dismissed as apocryphal, contains elements that resonate with African cosmology and ritual practice, highlighting a continuity of spiritual understanding that predates modern interpretations. These connections challenge the notion that African spirituality was peripheral or primitive. Instead, they underscore its foundational influence on global religious thought. The traces of African spirituality are also evident in modern religious practices. Many Christian ceremonies and rituals echo ancient African rhythms, chants, and mantras, often adapted and incorporated without acknowledgement. Processions, rhythmic call and response chants, and symbolic gestures can be traced back to African ceremonial practices, reflecting a continuity of spiritual technique that mainstream history has frequently ignored or erased. Archaeological and textual evidence consistently demonstrates that African spiritual systems were sophisticated, complex, and directly integrated into daily life, governance, and morality. Yet, much of this knowledge was deliberately marginalized, dismissed as superstition, or hidden within layers of imposed religious narratives. Despite these efforts at erasure, the legacy of African spirituality endures. Ceremonial objects, oral histories, and symbolic practices continue to carry the essence of this knowledge, preserved in communities across the African continent and the diaspora. Masks, drums, and ritual instruments are not merely cultural artifacts. They are living vessels of ancestral wisdom, capable of transmitting guidance, protection, and energy across generations. Scholars and archaeologists uncovering these artifacts provide tangible proof that African civilizations developed spiritual systems on par with, and in some cases preceding, other ancient civilizations. Understanding this historical evidence and legacy is essential to reclaiming African spiritual heritage. It challenges simplified narratives and highlights the pervasive influence of African traditions on global religious thought. Recognizing these connections allows us to see African spirituality not as a relic of the past, but as a vibrant, enduring system of knowledge that continues to shape communities, beliefs, and spiritual practices today. By studying masks, drums, ceremonial objects, and ancient texts, we reconnect with a legacy that bridges the material and the spiritual, illuminating a history deliberately hidden but never fully erased. The hidden, forbidden side. The hidden or forbidden side of African spirituality reveals a sacred knowledge that was deliberately concealed, not because it was malevolent, but because it wielded immense power. Ancient African civilizations recognized the profound influence of spiritual energy and the direct connection individuals could maintain with the divine and their ancestors. This knowledge of natural forces, cosmic rhythms, and ancestral guidance was potent, capable of transforming communities, guiding leaders, and maintaining societal balance. The fear it inspired among conquerors and colonizers led to its systematic suppression, as those in power sought to control populations by erasing the spiritual autonomy that African communities once held. Central to this hidden faith were practices that allowed direct communication with ancestors and the spiritual world. No intermediaries were required. Ordinary people could access guidance, protection, and wisdom through ritual, meditation, and symbolic acts. Drumming, dancing, chanting, and other ceremonial practices were not mere cultural expressions. They were tools for harnessing energy, aligning intentions, and connecting with unseen forces. Sacred spaces, masks, and ritual objects amplified these practices, creating a living bridge between the material and spiritual realms. The knowledge contained within these rituals was carefully guarded, passed down orally, and integrated into communal life to preserve its power across generations. Historical persecution was rampant. Spiritual leaders, priests, and scholars who maintained these practices were often labeled heretics, accused of witchcraft, and subjected to torture or execution. European colonizers and religious authorities viewed their influence as a threat to political and religious dominance. Entire communities were coerced into abandoning their spiritual systems, while sacred texts, artifacts, and ceremonial spaces were destroyed. Yet, despite this repression, the knowledge survived, often camouflaged within festivals, music, and dance. Celebrations became vessels for preserving sacred rituals, hiding powerful traditions under the guise of entertainment or communal activity. The resilience of this hidden knowledge is remarkable. By adapting rituals to public life, African communities ensured that the essence of their spiritual practices endured, even in the face of extreme oppression. Drumming patterns, festival dances, and oral storytelling carried encoded wisdom, maintaining the energetic alignment and moral guidance that the faith provided. These practices not only preserved cultural identity, but also allowed people to retain a spiritual connection with their ancestors, the natural world, and the divine forces that governed existence. Today, understanding the hidden or forbidden side is crucial for reclaiming African spiritual heritage. It challenges the narrative that such knowledge was evil or dangerous, revealing instead a system of empowerment, healing, and moral guidance. By studying these rituals, dances, and ceremonial practices, we uncover a history deliberately obscured, yet living and dynamic, capable of guiding and inspiring modern communities. The hidden faith reminds us that spiritual power, once feared and suppressed, can be rediscovered, honored, and applied, connecting us to a legacy of resilience, wisdom, and ancestral guidance that has survived the test of time. Misconceptions and stigmas. African spiritual traditions have long been misunderstood and deliberately misrepresented. For centuries, colonizers, missionaries, and foreign powers labeled these practices as black magic, witchcraft, or evil, creating fear and stigma around indigenous faiths. This deliberate mischaracterization was a strategic tool to undermine the authority and influence of African spiritual leaders while promoting foreign religious systems. Communities that had thrived on ancestral knowledge, rituals, and sacred ceremonies were suddenly painted as superstitious or morally corrupt, erasing the profound wisdom embedded in their practices. The truth is starkly different. African spirituality was never about malevolence or harm. Its core purpose revolved around healing, protection, transformation, and empowerment. Rituals, chants, dances, and ceremonies were designed to align individuals with the natural and cosmic energies that govern life. Sacred objects, masks, and drums acted as conduits, channeling ancestral guidance and universal forces to maintain balance and harmony in daily life. Practitioners used this knowledge to heal the sick, protect communities from harm, and guide people through personal and societal challenges. Misconceptions often ignored the energy-based philosophy at the heart of African spirituality. Everything, humans, animals, nature, and the cosmos, was seen as interconnected, each action carrying energetic consequences. Rituals were therefore not superstitions, but intentional practices aimed at maintaining harmony, empowering individuals, and fostering communal well-being. By recognizing these truths, we can see that what was stigmatized as forbidden or evil was, in fact, a highly sophisticated system of knowledge and spiritual alignment. Understanding and reclaiming these practices today is crucial. It challenges the false narratives imposed by colonial and religious forces, restores cultural pride, and highlights the true purpose of African spirituality: a dynamic, life-affirming path of empowerment, protection, and deep connection with ancestral and natural energies. Spiritual philosophy. At the heart of African spirituality lies a profound philosophy of interconnected energy, a worldview that sees the universe as a living, dynamic system where everything, humans, animals, nature, and cosmic forces, is intimately connected. Unlike simplistic frameworks of good versus evil, African spiritual philosophy recognizes that energy flows in complex patterns, influencing life in visible and invisible ways. Every thought, action, and intention resonates across this network, shaping experiences, relationships, and the natural world. This holistic perspective empowers individuals to understand that life is not divided into binary categories but is a continuum of energy, balance, and cause. And ancestors occupy a central place in this spiritual philosophy. They are not distant figures of the past, but living entities in energy, guiding, protecting, and communicating with their descendants. Through rituals, offerings, and prayers, communities maintain this connection, ensuring that ancestral wisdom continues to influence decisions, healing practices, and moral guidance. Ancestors serve as spiritual mentors, reinforcing cultural values and providing a moral compass for navigating life's challenges. Their presence reminds people that life extends beyond the physical, embedding the sacred into everyday existence. Nature, too, is sacred in this worldview. Trees, water, fire, and wind are divine manifestations, embodying the forces of creation and sustenance. Rivers are more than sources of water. They are vessels of spiritual energy. Forests are not mere landscapes. They are living temples. Fire carries transformative power, and the wind whispers ancestral messages. By recognizing the sacredness of nature, African spiritual systems cultivate respect, reciprocity, and sustainable interaction with the environment, teaching that humanity is a caretaker rather than a dominator. Rituals, drumming, dancing, singing, and ceremonial gestures serve as spiritual codes and energy language, aligning body, mind, and spirit. These practices are deliberate, each movement, sound, or rhythm designed to harmonize with universal energy and to channel ancestral guidance. Drumming patterns can communicate messages, while dance movements mirror cosmic cycles, enabling practitioners to participate actively in the flow of life. Singing, chants, and invocations activate spiritual energy, creating a shared resonance that strengthens communal bonds and individual awareness. Finally, actions are never neutral in this philosophy. Every intention carries energetic consequences, influencing personal destiny and the collective environment. Ethical conduct, reverence for ancestors, and mindful interaction with nature are not mere moral suggestions. They are energy alignments that shape reality. Misaligned actions can disrupt balance, while intentional, respectful behavior fosters harmony, prosperity, and spiritual empowerment. Understanding these principles allows individuals to live consciously, fully aware of the invisible threads connecting them to ancestors, nature, and the universe. African spiritual philosophy is therefore a sophisticated, holistic framework that integrates ethics, cosmology, and personal empowerment. It teaches that life is interconnected energy, that ancestors guide the living, that nature is divine, and that rituals are tools to align with universal forces. By embracing this philosophy, communities and individuals reconnect with a timeless wisdom that nurtures balance, resilience, and spiritual insight, offering guidance that remains profoundly relevant today. Cultural transmission. African spirituality did not vanish under the weight of slavery and colonization. Instead, it traveled across continents through the transatlantic slave trade, carried in the hearts, minds, and practices of enslaved Africans. While uprooted from their homelands, these communities ingeniously preserved their spiritual heritage, embedding it within daily life, music, dance, and communal rituals. What might have seemed like mere entertainment to outsiders often concealed layers of sacred knowledge, ancestral guidance, and energy alignment. Through adaptation and camouflage, African spiritual practices survived the brutal oppression of slavery. Drumming patterns, dances, and chants were transformed into forms that could be performed under scrutiny, yet retained their spiritual potency. Festivals became vessels for ancestral memory, subtly preserving rituals that connected communities to nature, the cosmos, and the spiritual realm. Storytelling carried encoded wisdom, ensuring that each generation received guidance, moral lessons, and a sense of identity rooted in ancestral traditions. The spread of African spirituality influenced the cultural and religious landscapes of the Americas, the Caribbean, and beyond. Elements of Yoruba, Congo, and other African spiritual systems are evident in rituals like Voodoo, Santeria, Candomblé, and even in music and dance traditions across the diaspora. The resilience and adaptability of these practices highlight the ingenuity of enslaved communities, who, despite systemic attempts to erase their identities, ensured that spiritual knowledge continued to flourish in new contexts. Cultural transmission shows that African spirituality is dynamic and enduring. It survived because it was alive in people, not confined to texts or temples. By understanding these adaptations, we can trace the invisible threads linking African ancestors to present-day spiritual practices worldwide. Recognizing this legacy allows us to honor the ingenuity, resilience, and sacred wisdom that continues to inspire communities today. Political and social threat. African spiritual systems were never just cultural expressions. They were sources of autonomy, social cohesion, and spiritual power. Communities rooted in these traditions had a clear understanding of their own governance, moral order, and energy-based spiritual frameworks. This independence of thought and practice directly challenged colonial authorities and foreign religious institutions, who sought to dominate both the physical and spiritual lives of African peoples. By controlling belief systems, colonizers could manipulate populations, weaken resistance, and consolidate power. The spiritual empowerment of African communities was therefore perceived as a threat to colonial and church authority, making suppression a top priority. The strategies employed were deliberate and calculated. Sacred rituals, ceremonies, and communal practices that fostered unity and spiritual insight were targeted for erasure, labeled as witchcraft or paganism, and often prohibited under colonial rule. Leaders, priests, and practitioners who maintained these spiritual systems were monitored, persecuted, or punished, creating an atmosphere of fear and control. By undermining traditional spiritual authority, colonizers ensured that communities would become dependent on Western institutions for guidance, moral instruction, and social order. This suppression went beyond physical domination. It was a battle over knowledge and power. Erasing African spiritual practices disrupted ancestral transmission of wisdom, severed connections to communal ethics, and obscured the historical memory that empowered societies. Yet, despite these efforts, fragments of spiritual knowledge endured. Through music, dance, festivals, and oral traditions, communities subtly preserved their autonomy and ancestral wisdom, adapting to survive in a world that sought to silence them. Understanding the political and social threat posed by African spirituality reveals why suppression was so aggressive, and why reclaiming these traditions today is both a cultural and spiritual act of resistance, empowerment, and liberation. The history of suppression underscores that spirituality is never neutral. It is inherently linked to identity, freedom, and collective power. Personal connection. African spirituality is not just a historical or cultural phenomenon. It is a living path for self-discovery and personal empowerment. At its core, it encourages individuals to awaken their inner power, reconnect with ancestral roots, and recognize the energy that flows through their being. By engaging with these spiritual traditions, people can rediscover a profound sense of identity, purpose, and belonging, linking the past to the present in a meaningful and transformative way. The journey begins with self-reflection and the recognition that many beliefs and narratives have been imposed by external authorities, often obscuring authentic spiritual paths. African spiritual practices challenge individuals to question these imposed doctrines and to explore a worldview where humans, nature, and the divine are deeply interconnected. Through rituals, meditations, drumming, and ancestral reverence, practitioners learn to attune themselves to energies beyond the material world, experiencing guidance, healing, and personal growth. Connecting with African spiritual roots is also a reclamation of heritage and wisdom that colonial powers and religious institutions attempted to erase. By consciously engaging with rituals, festivals, and ancestral teachings, individuals revive traditions that were once silenced, allowing the knowledge of their forebears to inform daily life. This connection is not passive. It is active, intentional, and transformative, enabling people to navigate challenges with insight and spiritual resilience. Ultimately, personal connection through African spirituality fosters a deep sense of empowerment, clarity, and purpose. It teaches that identity is intertwined with ancestral memory, that energy flows through all aspects of life, and that true spiritual freedom comes from understanding and aligning with these forces. For viewers exploring this path, it is an invitation to awaken, question, and embrace a spirituality that is authentic, rooted in centuries of wisdom, and profoundly life-changing. Modern relevance. Rediscovering African spirituality today is not merely an academic exercise. It is a journey of cultural reclamation, spiritual awakening, and identity restoration. For centuries, colonialism, forced conversion, and cultural suppression sought to erase the profound knowledge and practices of African civilizations. Yet, the resilience of these traditions reminds us that reconnecting with ancestral faith is both possible and deeply transformative. In a modern context, rediscovering this spiritual heritage allows individuals and communities to reclaim a sense of identity that has been obscured or distorted by centuries of imposed narratives. African spirituality PE